We already have people in YouTube.
Estamos ao vivo já.
Tá bom.
Vamos lá.
And do you have many students who are taking this subject at master's level or PhD level? Or is it very popular in Brazil?
Ela quer saber quantos alunos tem no programa, no pós-graduação, no doutorado. Mais,
300 or 400, I think.
Wow.
I am one of them.
Good. That's very impressive.
Now is my supervisor.
So what are you working on?
Yeah, I'm working with Elie Wiesel, Holocaust.
Holocaust literature. Right. Great. How far through are you? Nearly finished or at the beginning?
In half of
in the middle.
December 10th, I'm going to qualify, and then I have all the next year to finish.
Right. Good.
I've been praying about it.
Yeah, the middle can be difficult when you're just trying to go through.
Right.
Yeah.
Ela perguntou no que parte do caminho eu estava. Eu falei que eu estou mais ou menos na metade e pedi para ela orar por mim.
Ela é pastora.
É pastora, né? She's a pastor. You can pray for me, of course.
Alison, can you let's wait another 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Ok.
Sure. That's
Nós vamos falar mais 5 minutos, pessoal, tá bem? Daí a gente já começa.
Ok. Last year, I went to Poland. I visited Auschwitz, and then the ghettos of Warsaw, the zoo of Warsaw, Krakow. So I walked around. It's hard, very hard to see these places.
Oh, indeed, that's quite a trip. Yes.
And then I went to Jerusalem, Yad Vashem Museum.
Oh, yes, I've been there. It's
Yeah.
a haunting place, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. How long ago did you go there?
I've been several times. I take students who are studying for the ministry on study trips to Israel and to Rome and to Geneva. And so the last time I was there was probably about 4 years ago. We should have gone last year to Israel, but obviously we didn't go. We did something else instead. But yeah, I know that's museum very well.
Ela esteve no Israel, foi para Roma, outros lugares, né? Há 4 anos atrás. You have to come to Brazil to visit us.
Yes. And you must come to. Have you been to Scotland?
Yeah.
Before?
No. I went to England. I went to London.
Just come
I
a
have
little
a teacher in the university from Scotland. I really loved her accent. When she started teaching, I said, "Oh, wow."
Well,
she was from Glasgow, I suppose. I don't remember. Maybe
Glasgow.
Yeah.
right. Well, I come from Stirling, which is between Glasgow and Edinburgh.
Okay.
My accent is probably closer to a Glaswegian's accent than someone properly from Edinburgh. Yeah. I don't know.
The name is Sterling?
Stirling. Yes, I come from Stirling. Yeah.
Okay.
Right between Edinburgh and Glasgow.
Okay. Tô entendendo bem, né, Nelson? O inglês é bom.
O geral tá. O geral.
O inglês é muito bom.
Nada, que isso. Alison, can we begin?
Yes. Very good.
Podemos? Ion, tudo bem para você?
Isso.
Tudo bem? Bem, nós vamos começar, pessoal, nós estamos aqui dando continuidade à 9ª jornada Bíblia e Literatura. Essa jornada ela é elaborada pelo grupo de pesquisa núcleos de estudo Bíblia e Literatura, que eu coordeno com o professor Cristiano Aguiar, que é ligada ao CNPq, e esse ano a gente está fazendo a jornada trabalhando a questão da recepção de textos bíblicos pela literatura. Então, a gente teve já uma palestra com a professora Regina Zilberman, e agora temos a professora Alison Jack também conosco. Eu lembro que vocês podem olhar aqui no chat do YouTube, nós temos um link físico, perdão, um link fixo aqui, onde a gente tem a tradução da palestra. Nós temos um texto, um arquivo com a tradução. Por quê? Porque a gente não quer fazer tradução simultânea para a gente não dobrar o tempo. Então, a professora Alison vai fazer a palestra dela, e quem quiser pode seguir através desse link aí a tradução, tá bem? Se alguém tiver alguma dificuldade, por favor, avise a gente. Então, eu faço aqui o início, né, da nossa palestra. Eu agradeço muito a professora Alison Jack, que aceitou muito prontamente o convite de estar com a gente, falando aqui na nossa jornada. A professora Alison Jack é professora de Bíblia e Literatura e também diretora do New College, da Escola de Divindade da Universidade de Edimburgo, Reino Unido. Ao longo da sua carreira acadêmica, ela tem procurado integrar o interesse pela literatura inglesa e escocesa com o estudo da Bíblia, e ela tem se fixado nos séculos 19 e 20. Ela também trabalha com diversas comunidades religiosas, e isso tem permitido para ela um envolvimento muito frutífero com leitores comprometidos e interessados em textos bíblicos, e isso tem gerado uma série de possibilidades de trabalho. As pesquisas da professora Jack se dão em torno da educação religiosa e moral em escolas de ensino fundamental e médio, e isso também tem dado bastante subsídios para as pesquisas dela. Eu menciono apenas algumas obras que ela produziu, algumas delas de organização. Então, a primeira, mais recente, que ela organizou é Poesia Religiosa Escocesa, do século VI ao presente, isso em 2024, ano passado. Ela organizou também a Bíblia na ficção policial e no drama, Textos Assassinos, em 2019, e ela é autora dos seguintes livros: O Filho Pródigo na Literatura Inglesa e Americana, de 2019, a Bíblia, Literatura, de 2012, e Leitura de Textos Sagrados e Seculares, de 1999. Bem, é isso. O Ion está conosco, o professor Ion é doutorando no nosso programa. Ele fará a tradução quando a gente houver necessidade. Ele vai fazer um resumo agora para a professora Alison. E a professora Alison vai fazer a palestra. Aqueles que quiserem, seguem com esse link que está aqui no chat. Ao final, a gente faz uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. Então, sejam todos bem-vindos e obrigado.
Professor Alison Jack, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon here in Brazil, night in Scotland. Professor Leonel is the coordinator of Bible and Literature program at Mackenzie University, and he made your academic presentation, what you've been studying, who you are, and etc., etc., etc. And we are very glad to welcome you. Okay, and at the end of your speech, we are going to open for questions for a Q&A moment. Okay, and thank you very much for being with us. And please, you're anxious. We look forward to hear from you. Okay.
Thank you so much. Do we have the beginning, the first slide? Thank you.
You can, no, is going to share it.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Got it. Super.
Okay. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Lionel for inviting me to speak at this august gathering. I take it to be a great honor, and I want to thank the team who've translated my script and my slides, and I hope you're able to follow and it all makes sense to you. Can we have the next slide, please? The English poet, Felix Dennis, confidently advises, never go back, never go back, never return to the haunts of your youth. And that advice not to go back home is often not heeded by the prodigal son characters who inhabit the many examples of literature in English I've explored in my book, The Prodigal Son in English and American Literature, 500 Years of Literary Homecomings. It would be fair to say, though, that the decision about whether or not to go back is often one that these literary prodigal sons wrestle with. The process of decision-making is a moment this literature likes to play with or focus on. And while Felix Dennis cautions at the end of his poem that no one is waiting and no one is there, those literary prodigal sons who do return seem to experience many different receptions. More often than not, someone is waiting and something is there for them. But the homecoming is often complicated and unresolved, just as it is in the parable. And this is what we'll be exploring today. Now, I worked on this book that you can see on the slide for so long that I can find the paradigm of the prodigal son in just about everything I read and every TV drama and film that I watch. But I do think it's true that authors seem drawn to the story of the prodigal son, his waiting parent, and to a much lesser extent, his stay-at-home brother. Many authors have appealed directly or indirectly to the parable through their use of character and the narrative tropes they follow, presumably with the expectation that their efforts to go back to the story will be met with recognition and understanding on the part of the reader, and with the expectation that we as readers are waiting, we're there and ready either to be the grace figure responding with forgiveness, or sometimes to be the judgmental older brother. What I'm going to offer today is an overview of some aspects of my research, and then I'll focus on one poet, Elizabeth Bishop, in more detail. It's going to be a whistle-stop tour, and I'll be happy to go into more details about any of the texts I mention when it comes to time for questions. But I hope to refer to at least some texts that you're familiar with as we go through things. What I'm not doing is identifying every occasion when the prodigal son is mentioned in literature in English. There's no attempt to be comprehensive here. Instead, I'm exploring literary periods and genres and categories in which the prodigal son paradigm is particularly pronounced, looking at what aspects of the parable are focused on in this literature, and ways in which the parable is changed and adapted and read against the grain. A feature of my work up until now has been an interest in the way literature may be read as contextual biblical exegesis. By that I mean how literary texts function as interpretations of the Bible which reflect the context in which they're written. And this approach is more prevalent in some chapters of the book than in others, but it does play into the background of most of what I'm going to say today. And I should also define what I mean by the presence of the prodigal son in literature. In some of the texts I consider, there's a direct reference, sometimes even in the title of the work, as it is in some of the Elizabethan plays and some of the American short stories. Shakespearean characters often refer directly to the prodigal son, sometimes in a joking and pretty insignificant way. But Shakespeare also reworks the narrative shape of the parable, of fragmentation caused by rebellion of some sort, followed by repentance and return to apparent unity, with only minimal allusion to the specific aspects of the biblical story. And this is a pattern, a narrative shape, that we see in some of the Victorian novels I consider too. And then there's the poetry, which asserts its connection to the parable, often in the title and then reworks it in completely new contexts. What I'm saying here is that I don't need the words prodigal son to appear in a text to consider a connection between the literary and the biblical narratives. And when these specific words, prodigal son, or some aspect of the biblical text, when they do appear, or another phrase from the parable is quoted, it may or may not have particular significance. So I'm not taking a classic biblical intertextuality approach, looking for and categorizing quotation, allusion, and echo. Rather, I'm following the approach of two literary critics, both of whom wrote in the 1990s about the influence of the parable on American domestic dramas. And that's a period in a genre I don't consider because they covered it so effectively and comprehensively. The two critics are Leah Hadomi, who wrote The Homecoming Theme in Modern Drama, The Return of the Prodigal in 1992, and Jeffrey S. Prohl, who wrote Coming Home Again, American Family Drama and the Figure of the Prodigal in 1997. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Two quotations from their work are offered. Here's the first of them, as they've informed my approach. Here, Hadomi writes that the parable may be read as an analogy for man's eternal strife, his fight against sin, and his attempt to return to innocence. But its appearance in literature may signal that the comfortable myth has become the alienating literary reality. The parable is a powerful archy pattern which persists, deconstructed, even if there is no father to return to. The point of interest is not the way the literary text affirms the parable, but the way the parable is transformed in literature by the experience of the human condition, that the reality of homecoming is continually disappointing, although the yearning remains. So that's one sort of background that I follow or that I'm interested in my work. If we can have the next slide, please. Great, we'll have it in the Portuguese, just on to the next one.
O próximo está traduzido em português. O próximo.
That's it, thank you. Now, here's my other interlocutor. This is Jeffrey Prohl. For Prohl, the paradigmatic and contextual complexity of the relationship between the parable and the literary text is highlighted. So here's the quotation. Sorry it's so long, but it's good. To my mind, the fundamental need is to see the paradigm as such, to see it moving in and about domestic drama in a number of ways, to appreciate, when appropriate, the complexity of forms it takes, along with its more or less naive persistence, to use an awareness of conventionality to read against the naturalizing, self-affirming truth claims of realism and autobiography, so central to American theatre, to understand that our narratives have a history, that in some degree Eugene O'Neill's late plays, to take one set of examples, find their foreshadowings not only in the author's life experiences, but also in certain 19th century temperance melodramas, some Renaissance comedies, the stained glass windows of Chartres Cathedral, and Augustine's Confessions. So, from that long quotation, for Prohl, there's a big picture to consider when it comes to the use of such a strong and persistent paradigm as the parable of the prodigal son, which includes the life of the author, but also his or her literary, religious, and cultural context. We might compare Prohl's interest in the parable's complexity, persistence, conventionality, and wide foreshadowings to more traditional reception history approaches in biblical studies. In this field, the traditional biblical intertextuality field, there has been considerable focus on the reception history of the parables. And it's striking how often the parable of the prodigal son is used as an exemplar for this sort of inquiry. We'll have the next slide, please. And we'll have it in Portuguese, please, the next slide. Thank you. A representative and fairly recent example from biblical studies is the work of David Gowler in his Parables After Jesus from 2017. Gowler is motivated by the belief that finding analogies between texts leads to deeper reflection on their hermeneutical possibilities and a reduction in the limiting biases of individual interpretations. He finds a quotation from Bakhtin a useful guide, and it's here. Truth is not born, nor is it to be found inside the head of an individual person. It is born between people collectively searching for truth in the process of their dialogic interaction. Now, such a perspective reads parables as riddles with an answer to be discovered, and reads works of literature or art which allude to these parables as rewarding the reader with new insights into the earlier text. For Gowler, truth has a fixed quality, and it's important to assert that not every interpretation is of equal value or significance. He says, even dialogic narratives, like parables, provide buoys in the channel of interpretation that encourage interpreters to navigate within certain boundaries of readings. He affirms, among others, Calvin's concern about the double-edged nature of parabolic discourse. For Calvin, he reminds us, parables derive their rhetorical effect and power from their indirection, particularly for the elect. But their obscurity may also lead fallible and reprobate humanity into dark and obscure places. Nevertheless, for Gowler, engaging in the interpretation of others in various media is a worthwhile exercise, as it can, as he says, can make one's own interpretations more cogent and comprehensive. So the point I'm making is that there is a functional aspect to this foray into the reception history of the parables, which approaches both the parables and the later works as means to getting closer to some undefined truth. And this truth is hidden within or behind the parable. And the later text offers additional clues to the parable interpreter as detective. In his conclusion, Gowler emphasizes further his motivation for exploring the reception of parables. It is to increase understanding that leads to action on the part of the reader. Gowler's reading of the significance of the parable of the prodigal son in the narrow range of texts he covers, highlights the difference in approach between some biblical studies and literary studies in terms of intertextuality. The presence of the prodigal son in later texts is explored by Gowler in order to understand the parable better. And for him, this includes its influence as revealed scripture on current readers. For literary critics such as Hadomi and Prohl, who we looked at a few minutes ago, the presence of the prodigal son and his story in later texts is worth exploring in order to understand those texts better and their complex relationship with their culture in its widest sense, which might include their religious context, but isn't limited to that religious context. In my work, I try to draw together the insights of biblical studies and an exegetical response to the parable, with literary criticism's focus on the later text and its willingness to read flexibly, even against the grain of the parable. I want to understand the parable better, but not at the expense of understanding the later text, the literary text, better too. So I'll briefly sketch now some of the moments in literary history or generic similarity on which I focus, and then I'll look more deeply at the work of the poet Elizabeth Bishop. Could we have our next slide, please? So, Shakespeare. In the work of William Shakespeare, the prodigal son appears as a figure from a shared tradition, with the assumption that his story is known without the need for retelling or excessive signalling. Not every appearance of the prodigal son as a reference point in Shakespeare has great moral, religious, or even narrative significance. But in several plays, the paradigm of rebellion against authority is invoked in what may be described as a creative commentary on the biblical text. The moment of reconciliation in the parable is more prominent in these plays than it was in the earlier traditional prodigal son plays of the previous century. It's a strong and prolific tradition of slightly earlier prodigal son plays in English. And it's focused in Shakespeare. It's focused on in a way which scrutinizes the conventional biblical use of the trope. So I have two examples. The first is Henry IV, Part 1. In this play, the authority represented by the king is questioned as much as the motive for and the completeness of the repentance of the son, Prince Hal. Invoking the convention of the parable highlights the distance of the society created by the father figure or king in Shakespeare's play from the world of grace-filled possibility which we find in the biblical text. The basic conceit of the play, as I'm sure you remember, is that Hal, the son, assumes the role of the prodigal son to improve his standing with his father and the people, deceiving everyone in the process. His key soliloquy indicates that he has neither turned his back on all that home represents, nor is he a repentant returner. He says, "Yet herein will I imitate the sun, who doth permit the base contagion clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, that, when he please again to be himself, being wanted, he may be more wondered at by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapours that did seem to strangle him." Now, for me, the language of the parable of the prodigal son is alluded to in the line, "when he pleased again to be himself," echoing the moment when the prodigal came to himself in the parable in his hour of desperation. Now here, the moment of coming to himself is entirely in the control of the speaker, Hal himself, who has permitted the base contagion clouds to obscure him. I wonder, of course, if we as readers are meant to realize that the son, S-U-N, has little agency in this. But I don't think we're meant to doubt that Hal believes he has. Meanwhile, the king's acceptance of Hal's return to grace is highly dependent on Hal going on to prove himself against their enemies. Hal is forced to promise to redeem all this on Percy's head, and in some closing of some glorious day, be bold to tell you that I am your son. And so the play may be read as a critical exegesis of the parable, highlighting its exegetical lacunae. For example, why does the prodigal son leave in the first place? And what prompts his return? And it can also be read as a critique of the structures of power at the time, which demand such a transactional basis, even for family relationships. the king will welcome him back as a son if he goes and proves himself against their enemies. So that's a little insight into Henry IV, part 1, and some of the ways in which I think the prodigal son paradigm works out. So reading against the grain of the parable. If we move to my other key play, King Lear, gender and generational roles are reversed, so that Cordelia, the daughter, is associated at first with the child, but ultimately in the play with the father. And Lear, the father, with the father at first, and then with the son in the parable. There's a switching of roles. There's also a Christological overlay to Cordelia's character of forgiving self-sacrifice, which brings the king stroke son to a moment of repentance for his actions. Now, this accords with the play as a tragedy, but it also prefigures later theological and Christological readings of the parable, in which the prodigal son is in some ways read as a Christ figure. When Edgar closes the play with an affirmation of Cordelia's way of speaking what we feel, not what we ought to say, there's a rejection of the ways of the past and the possibility of new life based on the values she has represented, not the way of the father. There's a new way of understanding what is important in the new kingdom. The association of the parable, I'll admit this, with the play is quite oblique. Here are two examples of where I see some crossover moments with the parable. Poor perdu, Cordelia says of Lear, whom she also calls a child-changed father. So poor perdu, the lost one, and the father is a child-changed father. And there, for me, seem to be hints that we are to hear something of the prodigal son story. It's fluid and quite different from the prodigal son play tradition of earlier decades, which had praised the conservative and had punished rebellion. In the pagan world of this play, there is nevertheless a profoundly Christian theological message, as well as a political one, in which rebellion against authority is implicitly affirmed in certain circumstances, at least. Okay, well, let's move now to Victorian novels. So let's have the next slide, please. Thank you. In the examples of 19th century fiction by female authors that I'm interested in, characters changing responses to biblical texts, such as the parable of the prodigal son, mark changes in their, or stages in their development, as well as something of the narrator's perspective on traditional religious values. The way characters discuss and inhabit biblical stories, such as the prodigal son, may be read, for me anyway, as contextual exegeses of the parable. My two examples are Gaskell's North and South and George Eliot's Adam Bede. In Adam Bede, George Eliot is critical of Dinah, one of the key characters, Dinah's random use of the Bible in scenes which she opens her Bible and reads off answers to current dilemmas. So if we're in the world of biblical exegesis or biblical readings, and George Eliot, it seems to be where the narrator is critical of that approach to biblical reading. Simply open the Bible and read out of it what you want. In my other text, in North and South, Gaskell offers Margaret, again the key character, many opportunities to engage more deeply in biblical interpretation and with characters from different walks of life, and to relate her understandings of text, such as the parable of the prodigal son, to her experiences in Milton, which is the city she's in, and the new relationship she makes there. It's a more engaged and positive way of thinking about exegesis of the Bible in this novel. Eliot's Adam Bede's identification with the paradigm of the prodigal son is more complex still. The anxious fear that Adam will leave the family is expressed by both his mother and his brother, and he does make an attempt to leave early in the novel, prodigal-like, driven out by his exasperation with his father's drinking. However, a sense of guilt quickly forces his return, although his ensuing resentment against his father fixes his attitude to all others who fail. But Adam Bede is later aligned to the character of the prodigal son without even physically leaving home. Unexpected external forces drive him to new understandings about himself and others. He undergoes a transformation as profound as that described by the father in the parable, of moving from a position of lostness to foundness, from death to life, in his regeneration as a person of sympathy for the afflicted. In, for example, his response to Hetty's trial for the murder of her baby. His later marriage to Dinah completes this integration of innovation and tradition personified by home, in which he has empathy for others and is able to accept that which is beyond his control. In the marriage, Dinah takes on the role of the watchful parent, which his mother had previously inhabited, always looking out for his return. But the relationship between Dinah and Adam is such that there is an expectation he will return out of mutual love and duty. His mother's anxieties and religious demands have been superseded. This mutual love and duty are reconciled through free will and individual decision, rather than obedience to parental will or, crucially, adherence to religious conviction. And we can easily see George Eliot's religious and philosophical underpinnings here. We turn to North and South. For Gaskell, for her character Margaret, it is the older brother in the parable who paradigmatically informs her character development. In her dutiful care of her dying mother, Margaret assumes the spirit of the elder brother with capitals, and a contrast is made between her and her absent brother Frederick, who's the child favoured and idolised by their mother and their servant. Frederick returns home briefly, but his character as well as his circumstances mean he cannot stay at home. And so it is Margaret who is the character who finds a way to adapt to and thrive in her new situation, coming to a new understanding about herself, her place in the family, and the world of work which her suitor, John Thornton, represents. Gaskell presents the figure of the stay-at-home brother in a new light, when opportunities for growth and service to others are taken. A further contrast is made between Margaret's mother, anxious about the strength of the bond between them, and Thornton, her suitor's mother, unnaturally protective, even idolatrous of her son. Reconciliation through shared suffering marks Margaret's mature relationship with her mother. In contrast, Thornton must reject his mother's hold over him in order to marry the woman he loves. Growing up for both Margaret and Thornton means taking responsibility for themselves in the wider society of which they are a part. And Gaskell's Unitarian social convictions are not hard to distinguish here. And so I argue that in both novels, the paradigm of the prodigal son is exegeted in a way which reflects the religious and ethical stance of their writers. For both, the resolution of innovation and tradition signals the growing up of the main characters. Okay, next slide, please. So now we're looking at the prodigal son in the American short story tradition. And the American short story tradition is very wide-ranging and diffuse. We might say it begins with Washington Irving in 1819 and continues through and beyond the work of Flannery O'Connor into the early 1960s. But it's striking how often the prodigal son is alluded to directly or indirectly within it. And a common feature in these stories and their interaction with the parable is their exploration of the effect of the changes which take place in the son who leaves. In the American short story tradition, exemplified by Thomas Wolfe's duo of stories under the title The Return of the Prodigal, these changes are so profound, they often mean that return is troubled or even impossible. Some stories, such as Henry James's The Jolly Corner, raise the question of what would have happened had the prodigal son stayed at home. In others, such as Hamlin Garland's Up the Coulee, the plight of the elder brother is considered from the perspective of the now much more successful younger brother. The relationships within these families are complex, and moral certainties about the actions taken, even when they follow the prodigal son paradigm, is not assured. The focus and narrative resolution generally belong firmly to the younger son rather than to the father in these stories, which marks a shift from the parable itself, in which the father has the last word. Also notable in some stories, at least, is a narrative stance which is detached and skeptical about the explicit attempts of the characters to align themselves within the prodigal son paradigm. Now, conclusions may be drawn about the role of the parable in the form of these stories and about its fluid attractiveness to the American context in the 19th and 20th centuries. First, the parable offers a shared narrative which sets up expectations and the possibility of surprise and deviation from these expectations in a really economical way in terms of word count. The short story, like the parable, is well suited to focusing on the movement from rebellion to return and acceptance without the need for subplots, including the scene with the older brother, as many of these short stories do, leaves resolution characteristically open-ended. Can we have the next slide, please? Second, as Susan Manning had observed with regard to Washington Irving, a common motif in American literature is the figure of the son, here's the quotation, the son who yearns again and again to identify with an idealized father or fatherland, a good past, only to find himself held at arm's length as often as he seeks the embrace. The history of the birth of the American nation, its ongoing relationship with the United Kingdom, an idealizing of personal independence, and the pursuit of individual happiness and fortune, potentially at the expense of family tradition, as well as a distinctively American Protestant search for personal redemption. All of these might play into this fascination with the parable of the prodigal son. It's a fascination which is fraught with potential disappointment and lack of fulfillment, acknowledged even as it's indulged. And we see here perhaps the genesis of the sort of conclusion Kroll and Hadomi identified in later American drama that I mentioned at the beginning. Let's have the next slide and we'll start looking more closely at Elizabeth Bishop. Thank you. In the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop, home has shifted from being a place to be longed for to a place which may have to be left behind. Bishop's output, as I'm sure you know, was not extensive, but she wrote a poem which refers directly to the prodigal son, and prodigal son themes echo in other poems too, specifically one from the perspective of that great shipwrecked character, Robinson Crusoe. I will argue here that for Elizabeth Bishop, the significance of home shifts ambivalently throughout her work. Bishop was raised between the poles of American life, represented by Nova Scotia and Boston. She was independently wealthy, at least until the end of her life, and she traveled widely, living for long periods, as I'm sure you're aware, in Brazil. Her poem, A Prodigal, was written before she went to Brazil in the second of 2 periods she spent in an artist colony in Saratoga Springs in New York, during which time she was being treated for alcoholism. Completed in 1950, it was published in the New Yorker in 1951 and appeared in the collection A Cold Spring. Can we have the poem, please? And we'll have it in its Portuguese version, please. Thank you. So let me read the poem, A Prodigal. The brown, enormous odour he lived by was too close, with its breathing and thick hair, for him to judge. The floor was rotten. The sty was plastered halfway up with glass smooth dung. Light lashed, self-righteous, above moving snouts, the pig's eyes followed him, a cheerful stare, even to the sow that also always ate her young, till, sickening, he leaned to scratch her head. But sometimes mornings after drinking bouts, he hid the pints behind the 2x4s. The sunrise glazed the barnyard mud with red. The burning puddles seemed to reassure. And then he thought he almost might endure his exile yet another year more. But evenings the first star came to warn. The farmer whom he worked for came at dark to shut the cows and horses in the barn, beneath their overhanging clouds of hay, with pitchforks, faint forked lightnings, catching light, safe and companionable as in the ark. The pigs stuck out their little feet and snored. The lantern, like the sun going away, laid on the mud a pacing aureole. Carrying a bucket along a slimy board, he felt the bat's uncertain, staggering flight, his shuddering insights beyond his control touching him. But it took him a long time, finally, to make up his mind to go home. At its heart, the poem questions the meaning of home, perhaps not surprising given the problematic nature of home for Bishop. As we know, her father had died when she was a baby, and her mother's mental health following his death led to her being unable to care for her daughter, and eventually to her permanent removal to hospital. At first, Bishop was cared for by her maternal grandparents in Nova Scotia, but later taken to her paternal grandparents and other relatives in Boston, where there was more disposable income available. She continued to return to Nova Scotia for holidays, but spent her later teenage years at the exclusive boarding school for girls, Walnut Hill. She was to comment later, "My relationship with my relatives, I was always a sort of guest, and I think I've always felt like that." Little wonder that home was an ambivalent term, and the almost throwaway comment at the end of the later poem, Questions of Travel, home, wherever that may be, might appropriately be added each time the term appears in her work. And this includes at the end of this poem, A Prodigal, in which home is one of only 2 end words in the poem with no corresponding rhyme. Now, we'll come back to this poem, but can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, this later poem, as I say, we'll come back to The Prodigal. Here's a later poem, Questions of Travel, asks questions about home, which a prodigal might be read as raising 2 and answering rather differently. At its heart, Questions of Travel explores the meaning of imagination and how it might best be employed to lead to truth. The poet asks, should we have stayed at home and thought of here? But goes on, but surely it would have been a pity not to have seen all that has been encountered through travel. Is it a lack of imagination that makes us come to imagined places, not just stay at home, she asks? Continent, city, country, society, the choice is never wide and never free. But there is a no before the closing question. Should we have stayed at home, wherever that may be? It would not have been right to stay at home instead of travelling, but home has no fixed meaning in this poem, in this Questions of Travel. So we're going to go back now to a prodigal. So next slide, please. And we'll take the Portuguese version. Next one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, in contrast, this poem, A Prodigal, home remains a place to which the speaker may indeed return, although its meaning has been redefined by his experience working in the pigsty. The perspective here is of the prodigal son, whose sense of pain, guilt, and alienation, fueled by alcohol, nevertheless longs for the connection and the redemption associated with home. Although brought to the depths of despair by his addiction, even in the pigsty, he is able to find images of home in the ark of the barn, safely filled with the animals by the farmer at night, and in the way the puddles seemed to reassure. This is a pigsty which offers him elements of homeliness, even in exile. And perhaps for this reason, as he says, it took him a long time finally to make up his mind, but to go home is his settled decision, and parallels with the parable suggest that he will be welcomed there. The horrifying image in the first stanza of the sow that always ate her young, who stares at him until, sickening, he leaned to scratch her head, has perhaps two functions in the poem. It suggests something close to horror in terms of the potential for harm within family relationships. But it's also clear that the pig belongs firmly to the world of the speaker's exile, rather than the place to which he might return. An intensely personal poem, rooted in the experiences of Bishop's alcoholism, there is an ambivalence about what home means and where it may be found. Nevertheless, there is a sense here that home is worth seeking and aiming for, which later poems from a more settled and self-confident period in her life are less certain about. That Bishop would find the prodigal son trope a powerful one through which to explore a troubled response to home and homecoming is not surprising, given her early exposure to Christian practices, although she had moved away from active belief as an adult. This ongoing influence of faith, coupled with deliberate exile from its source, mirrors the dilemma she reflected in her poetic explorations of the significance of home. Thomas J. Travisano argues that she approached a Christian symbol as a modern agnostic with a religious education and the spiritual expectations created by that education. So what Bishop offers us in her prodigal poem is a secular yet sympathetic parody. In the place of a theological emphasis on God's unqualified love for the individual, we're offered a psychological portrayal of an alcoholic's entrapment in his addiction. The ache of human homelessness is imported into this retelling of the quintessential biblical homecoming story. Now, Bishop talked of this poem as a healing fiction, which brought her pleasure, but it does so not by bringing the exile home, but by reconceiving the idea of home through her description of exile. The reader is invited to enter the inverted world of the alcoholic, to appreciate the beauty of the glass smooth dung, which is so lovely, or almost lovely, it makes it possible to stay. The disarray of the subject is contrasted with the tightness of the structure of the poem, a double sonnet, and of the meta-narrative of the parable. The result is a poem which waits in a place of pain, of alienation and bitterness, which emphasizes, as the parable does not, the significance of the moment of the long time before the finally, when the prodigal makes up his mind to go home. Well, so far the discussion has centered on a poem which explicitly evokes the parable of the prodigal son. But Bishop also wrote a poem about another character whose story has been mapped onto the parable, and that is the story of Robinson Crusoe. And let's have the next slide, please. Okay, so Bishop had begun writing Crusoe in England in 1963. This is a later poem, but it was finished in 1971 as she was rereading Darwin and visiting the Galapagos Islands with a friend from Harvard. It was published that year in November in the New Yorker. Identity in relation to others is at the heart of the poem, as it is at the heart of the parable of the prodigal son. And the perspectives offered on exile and on the possibility of meaningful return home further root both poems in the parable's concerns. The connection between Bishop's A Prodigal and her Crusoe in England have not been overlooked by other scholars. I'm not the first person to see this. Anne Stevenson suggests that the later poem, the Crusoe poem, extends and deepens the parable-like technique Bishop employed in A Prodigal, and that one might even say that Bishop's Crusoe is the prodigal come home at last, settled, forgiven, and yet somehow disappointed, let down. Writing about Bishop's poem A Prodigal, Colm Toybeen comments that for the prodigal, like Crusoe, it was easier to dream of home than to be there. The poem charts Crusoe's detached reflections on his island experience, but his reflections are from a distance of many miles and many years. The tone is mundane, descriptive. Here's a quotation from a much longer poem. He's remembering this from his homecoming now. The island smelled of goat and guano. The goats were white, so were the gulls, and both too tame, or else they thought I was a goat too, or a gull. An implicit connection with the prodigal son from the perspective of Bishop's Prodigal poem is made in the stanza about self-pity. I often gave way to self-pity. Do I deserve this? I suppose I must. I wouldn't be here otherwise. Was there a moment when I actually chose this? I don't remember, but there could have been. What's wrong about self-pity anyway? With my legs dangling down familiarly over a crater's edge, I told myself, pity should begin at home. So the more pity I felt, the more I felt at home. While pity is not emphasized in Bishop's poem A Prodigal, the question of choice and the finding of homeliness in the place of exile are certainly present, as they are in Crusoe. But the next slide, please. But the experience is also unrepeatable, the experience of exile, and beyond the comprehension of the society in which Crusoe now lives on his return. He says, my poor island still unrediscovered, unrenameable. None of the books has ever got it right. Accounts of the arrival of his companion Friday have everything wrong. Crusoe is the only witness to the experience of his exile and return, and this places him in an even more solitary position. Now he is alone at home on the new island, which is England. Without his companion, dear Friday, he is as lonely as he was on the deserted island. His possessions, once so filled with meaning, are now faded and given the status of museum pieces. With no witness to his experience, he is imprisoned within himself, and home has lost its significance. Could we have the next slide, please? Linda Anderson writes perceptively about the way in which Bishop's A Prodigal resists the narrative pull of the parable, and her comments are also applicable to the interaction between the story of Robinson Crusoe and Bishop's poem Crusoe in England. For Anderson, A Prodigal offers a version of a narrative impasse, a turning away by poetry from the teleology and closure of narrative. The poem is modelled on a well-known story in which the movement is from exile to return, repentance or self-understanding to forgiveness. But the poem is paused in the moment between decision and action, stasis and change. The expected return is postponed. This is the prodigal parable. The Prodigal poem. The expected return is postponed, perhaps indefinitely. In Crusoe in England, the poem sits in the period after the well-known story ends, reflecting from a distance on the events which form its basis, and destabilizing the notion of home which the story's end requires. The poem leaves open the question of who decides what is an island and what is home. As Anderson comments, desire for the plenitude of the ending, for a homecoming, may be deeply embedded not only in the original parable, but in the idea of the story itself, which rereads towards the culmination of meaning which the end can bring. However, in Bishop's work, time is not understood as an end-directed narrative, and there's a recognition of the way time asserts difference, insists on variation, and transforms any repetition or homecoming into something else, a movement away as well as a return. Earlier, I had suggested that the narrative drive of the parable in the earlier poem, the Prodigal poem, implies that home for the prodigal still exists, although the impetus to reach it is undermined. In the later poem, Questions of Travel, home has become a construct with little content. It is in the playing with the notion of time and the guiding narrative in both poems, which opens up the possibility that homecoming may be a loss as well as a gain, something to be desired, but also regretted, its very existence open to question. Could I have the next slide, please? The deliberate introduction of the language and themes of Luke 15 in these poems is startling and provocative settings, undermines any easy identification with the usual interpretations of the parable. Referring to the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop and identifying her loss of childhood faith, Colm Toybeen comments that when faith disappears, then the language of transcendence can have a special power because it evokes something that was once familiar, once possible, and is now lost. The use of the language of the parable reflects this power, but also highlights the sense of loss, both of faith and the possibility of home, which the parable presents. So I'm moving now to my concluding comments. We're nearly there. The poet Felix Dennis had urged, never go back, never return to the haunts of your youth. It is advice that was not heeded by the prodigal son, or by the many poets, playwrights, and novelists who have returned to the language of the parable, sometimes literally the language of their youth, but not their maturity, and found there a way to express something significant. Themes which have resonated in this literature have been those of rebellion, of exile, and the decision to stay, repentant or not, homecoming, and what it means to be lost and to be found. It has been argued here that this literature may be read as creative exegesis of the biblical text, reflecting something of the concerns of the time and the author. On occasion, the author may self-identify with the figure of the prodigal son, self-consciously seeking to resolve similar issues through the sharing of the positive direction of the narrative of the parable, at least up until the arrival of the elder brother. Alternatively, the literature may stop at a particular point in the story, often the moment of decision, and offer variations on the positive trajectory it takes. Or it may just stop and go no further, finding the hope of a forgiving welcome too difficult to imagine, because no one is waiting and nothing is there. To read literature as exegesis is to assume some insight into the perspective of the author, which is not always justifiable or illuminating. However, the power of the language such writers use remains. Toybeen continues his reflection on faithless language and the power of its evocation of the lost past in Bishop's poetry. And let's see that quotation in my final slide, please. So he says, a sort of homecoming is enacted by allowing the image to transform itself, to free itself from the shackles of the concrete, the positive, the world of things, and move like a boat sent to rescue someone into an uneasy, shimmering, almost philosophical, almost religious space, using words with both freedom and restraint, suggesting something that has not been formulated or imagined by anyone before. The experience of loss and a yearning for homecoming are at the heart of the parable of the prodigal son and of much of the literature which relates to it and shares its language and concerns. Sometimes those concerns sit within a world of belief and relate to a hope in a transcendent power. Sometimes they do not. Nevertheless, a sort of homecoming is shared between text and reader when the prodigal son is recognized in a new literary context, and that which might have been lost is found. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, professor Alison. Bill?
Thank you very much, Professor Alison.
Agora a gente pode ter uma sessão de perguntas para a professora. Eu agradeço muito, foi realmente um passeio aí pela literatura inglesa. E uma observação, professora, e eu acho que eu dou uma pausa.
Se puder fragmentar, me ajuda um pouquinho. Well, he thanked you very much for your presentation. It was a fantastic journey through British, especially Scottish and American literature.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Uma observação e uma pergunta.
One observation and a question.
À medida em que, como você mostra, à medida em que as releituras da parábola se afastam do sentido original,
as long as we start reading and traveling and our remake or our reinterpretation of the characters,
parece que essa parábola assume vida própria e se torna uma obra literária até maior do que a sua própria fonte. É a minha sensação. É a sua também na pesquisa?
He has the sensation, according to our reading, and we are this resignification, the tales or the stories gets a form just like bigger than the original source. And he wants to know if it's your sense, it's your feeling.
Oh, absolutely. I think this story speaks to something about the human condition that novelists and poets and playwrights have grabbed onto and have run with in new ways. I think this is really a universal story, this longing for homecoming, even when home no longer exists. There is something very real about that in the human psyche. Yeah.
Em linhas gerais, o que ela está falando é que é uma viagem à própria condição humana, né? Que é a história de todos nós. Né? Em linhas gerais, ela fala isso. Então, vai muito além, né? Isso capta exatamente o que nós somos, né? E traz para a nossa realidade.
Bom, eu tenho uma pergunta, mas eu vou abrir para se outros quiserem interagir.
Não sei se tem no chat, eu estou sem acesso ao chat do YouTube. Não sei se alguém digitou alguma coisa aí.
Eu estou olhando aqui. Bem, temos uma pergunta do professor Antônio Egno, da Universidade Federal do Tocantins. Você quer dizer para ela de onde ele é?
We have another question from the University in Tocantins, is another state in the central part of Brazil.
Poderia falar mais sobre seu método, que a senhora chama, salvo engano, de exegese criativa de textos bíblicos?
She wants to know if you can speak a little bit more about exegesis
exegese criativa de textos
Creative
bíblicos.
exegesis of biblical texts. If you can spread a little bit more about your method, I mean.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So my background is in New Testament studies, New Testament exegesis, and I'm interested in the way that biblical exegesis has developed over time, particularly about this parable. And there are several very modern readings of this parable which open up some of the unsaid things about it, like why does the son leave in the first place? What is happening at home to propel the son out of that place? And I think it's one of those unstated aspects of the parable that exegetes try to explain historically, that literary writers can sometimes help us to imagine in new ways. And it's those new ways that I'm particularly interested in, that the imagination of a writer can open up for us in the spaces the parable leaves open.
Eu vou tentar resumir, né? O que ela disse aqui para nós é que assim, a especialidade dela é o Novo Testamento, obviamente, a exegese do Novo Testamento, e que algumas nuances, algumas partes da história do filho pródigo estão escondidas, não aparecem. Então, como era o ambiente familiar, como é que era a vida dele, por que ele sai de casa, por que ele resolve ir embora, né? E nessas releituras eles trazem um pouco isso para a gente, né? Contextualizam um pouco mais sobre o que poderia ter acontecido com aquele jovem ao desejar sair de casa. Acho que é isso, né, Leonel? Não sei se tem mais.
Sim.
And I should say, in that case, it doesn't need to be historically plausible, such a reading. You know, the literature takes us further than that and appeals to our imaginations as well as to our sort of historical concerns. And that's fascinating to me.
A literatura nos permite, né, alçar esses voos e tentar descobrir o que o próprio texto não diz, né? Então é mais ou menos por aí.
But both approaches can sit side by side. Neither is necessarily better than the other. Yeah.
Isso aí.
Bem, eu deixo aberto para quem quiser ainda no chat fazer pergunta, mas eu faço a minha enquanto, né, alguém mais, se quiser articular, o próprio Ion também.
So, Professor Leonel is going to ask you a question. Please, Leonel.
Professora Alison, na pesquisa, porque num contexto europeu, Reino Unido, Estados Unidos principalmente, há autores de tradição protestante e católica.
In American literature and British literature, there are authors with Protestant influence. Okay?
E católica também.
And Catholic, of course.
É possível distinguir aproximações diferentes de cada uma das tradições religiosas ou não?
He wants to know if it's possible to see these differences of approach in Catholic and Protestant in their works.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I've never been asked that before.
Uma pergunta muito boa que ela nunca recebeu.
I think
There's always a first time.
you write a thesis about this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reflecting the authors I've spoken about today. I'm trying to think, are any of them explicitly Catholic? I don't actually think they are. Maybe I am drawn as a Protestant myself to the sort of Protestant reading. What I do remember discovering was some research had been done into the preaching habits of different Protestant denominations, and Baptist preachers were more likely to focus on the prodigal son, and Presbyterians were more likely to focus on the elder brother. And I think we could maybe see that as some of this.
Ela não viu assim diferenças entre a questão protestante ou católica, mas dentro das denominações protestantes. Por exemplo, a ênfase batista é mais no filho, do presbiteriano é no ancião, ou no pai que espera, e assim por diante.
E eu só explique para ela, a pergunta que a gente está num contexto muito católico, então talvez a recepção da parábola no Brasil pode ter alguma diferença.
O Brasil é o país com o maior número de católicos no mundo ainda.
Só explique para ela. Só explique a razão da pergunta por causa da questão do Brasil, né?
He's explaining why he's asking you these questions because Brazil is a very extreme Catholic country. Okay, the biggest Catholic country in the world. That's why he's asking that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do wonder if a Catholic interpretation of the prodigal son parable would be very different from a Protestant one.
Ela gostaria de saber, ela tem curiosidade se a interpretação católica é muito diferente da protestante.
Bom, se eu puder mencionar para ela, estava com a gente, não sei se ainda está, o Lucas Viana, doutorando nosso, que está estudando dois autores, e a recepção de dois autores. Raduan Nassar tem uma origem evangélica, eu acho, né? Mas o Jorge Amado é católico. Os dois, a recepção dos dois da parábola.
One of our students, PhD student, Lucas, é o pastor Lucas, né? He's a pastor, né? He's studying one Protestant author, but one, Jorge Amado, is Catholic.
Was it that student who was in Edinburgh?
Yes.
Yeah.
I met him, didn't I?
Yes.
I met him, yes. Well, I'll look forward to hearing his work, to finding out more. Yeah, tell him to let me know what he works out.
Só traduzindo, o Lucas é um colega do nosso programa que a professora Alison conheceu em Edimburgo.
Bem, mais alguém, gente? Aí, bom, a Cíntia tem uma pergunta. É um pouco grande, eu não acabei aqui no chat.
Puder resumir, a gente...
Cíntia, porque daí eu preciso sair daqui, né, para eu ver a sua pergunta. Se puder, Cíntia, resume.
Resumir, enquanto isso eu posso, se eu puder fazer um.
Bom, deixa eu ver, ela pôs aqui, estou tendo acesso já. Vamos lá. A releitura da parábola, conforme o contexto cultural e humano, e a exegese criativa presente em diversos textos literários, constitui uma amostra notável do diálogo entre as literaturas e o texto bíblico. Entretanto, ao se considerar apenas o texto bíblico da parábola do filho pródigo, surge uma questão. Qual o papel do pai como centro da narrativa e da reconciliação? De que forma o foco no pai, mais do que nos filhos, altera a compreensão teológica da parábola? Nessa leitura teológica, o que se destaca não é o filho pródigo, nem suas escolhas desastrosas, mas o pai, aquele que lida tanto com o retorno do filho, quanto com o ressentimento repentino do segundo.
A visão batista aí, a pergunta. Posso tentar?
Okay.
Qual é o nome dela? Cíntia?
Cíntia, pastora Cíntia.
Professora Cíntia, é isso?
Professora e pastora.
Professor and Pastor Cynthia is asking the father's view, okay? Remember, you said the Baptist view, okay? We always say in literature or in the text itself, the prodigal son, but what is the role of the father? If the father is not the center of the heart of the narrative.
Yeah. What I found is that in the American short story tradition, there are some examples where the perspective is that of the father who's searching for the son, and that there's a sense of regret, of loss, of concern, and of sometimes when they take on the role of the father in the prodigal son parable, too self-consciously, they are setting themselves up to be disappointed. And so I'm just trying to remember, there's Mr. Thompson's Prodigal, I think is the name of the particular short story I'm thinking of. And he is duped by someone else who turns out not to be his son. And I think someone like Susan Manning would perhaps say that that is something about the American psyche, where this sense of the individual and the personal, sort of personal salvation being important, of being of leaving home, of that being an important impetus, is reflected in the thwarted nature of the role of the father. So that in some of the literature I look at, the father is not the kind, gentle, waiting figure, but rather someone who is constraining, who's being set up to be disappointed. So just as the son in some of this literature has this yearning that's not fulfilled, so the father too does not always get what he longs for. It's a more against the grain reading of the story. I also the example of King Lear, where the father is inadequate in some way, who is making unrealistic demands, and the younger daughter Cordelia, has to take on some of the roles of the father and bring the father home. So it's literature again can play with that idea of the biblical father in quite creative ways. Sorry, there's a huge answer, Jon. Pick the best bit out.
Não, o que ela disse, assim, existe essa dualidade, acho que as duas coisas, né? Mas que a ênfase maior, pelo que eu entendi, na literatura, é a questão do filho mesmo, embora haja o filho arrependido, embora haja a questão do pai também, né? Essa expectativa do pai redentor, o pai que recebe, né? O pai que de alguma maneira lamenta pela partida desse filho, mas o cerne mesmo seria o filho. Acho que é isso, Leonel, não sei se há mais alguma coisa.
Eu acho que sim. Viu, Jon? E aí há um comentário, acho que talvez seja interessante fazer. Tem uma pergunta do Lucas aqui, eu já faço a pergunta.
Ah, o Lucas. Manda ele fazer em inglês.
Viu, Alison? Do ponto de vista de teologia e da literatura, eu acho que a gente pode, pelo menos eu estou tentando refletir alguma coisa sobre a parábola.
According to my feeling, my background of literature.
Ok. A ênfase, né, você mostrou, e os exemplos mostram, está na questão que Jesus propõe da discussão do pai representando Deus, os dois filhos representando o perdido, né, e os judeus, os líderes religiosos.
Mm-hmm. According to his interpretation, the father is God, okay, and the son probably who goes away is divided, the two sons, the Jewish people and the Gentiles, right, or the nations. This is what I meant? Gentios e judeus ou...
Não necessariamente, o que está longe de Deus, né, o mais novo.
The son who is far from God and the son who is with God. Okay.
Mas a parábola, ela tem uma potência literária tão grande que quando você mostra para nós a recepção, eu não sei aí em inglês, viu, Jon, mas é meio um tiro no pé, porque a coisa foi tão bem montada que ela foge do controle, né? E aí aparece esse tipo de recepção que a gente viu com a professora Alison.
He said the son is so rich, literally rich, okay, and what you brought to us, it's like, não sei como eu diria isso, tiro no pé, but it's like a prep, something much bigger, right, than we could imagine.
Well,
yeah, I hope that's that these stories, these poems and so on, do help us to read the parable in a more open sort of way. But
like a shot in the foot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That reminds us that the story, the parable, is literature itself. It's not a description of reality. It's self-consciously a literary construct, and because of that, it opens itself to metaphorical and imaginative readings, and literature helps us to remember that, just as our understanding of the parable helps us to understand these literary examples better too.
Abre grande leque de possibilidades, né? Isso que ela está dizendo.
Bom, em virtude do horário, eu vou fazer a última pergunta, que é um comentário, uma pergunta do Lucas. Okay? Só de esperar aqui a última pergunta, Ion.
Posso fazer? Entendi.
Você quer fazer? Não, eu tenho uma do Lucas.
Não, o Lucas quer fazer. Senão eu faço outra hora, eu escrevo para ela, não tem problema.
Não, fazemos as duas. Só de separar, então, que a gente já está fazendo as duas e a gente encerra. Pode ser?
For example, there is a Hebrew influence, for example, the pigs. What pigs mean to a Jew, right? So he went there, he went away, and being with the pigs is the end of the line, right? But when he said, I want my part of my heritage, he just like killed that father, because we have a right for heritage when our parents die. Okay, no, I want it now. You are dead for me, right? And my question is there any connection, for example, this New England to the cities of refugee in the Bible, and new relationships like Robinson Crusoe? He went there to that island, and it's like a refuge to him, or something like this. Is this kind of reinterpretation possible, in your opinion? Eu perguntei se a cidade de refúgio tem alguma conexão com a parábola do filho pródigo, especialmente quando fala da Nova Inglaterra, New England, e a questão judaica, né? Porque o que é um porco para um judeu matar o pai, né? Eu matei meu pai antes para ter o direito à herança, enfim. Então, é isso que eu queria comentar.
I mean, I certainly think of sort of the Elizabethan period just before, when, as I say, there was an explosion of prodigal son plays, prodigal son plays, and in those, the prodigal son did not receive a warm welcome home. He is sometimes he's imprisoned or he dies, and the sense is that the story is told to quash rebellion, to say life just now is complicated in Elizabethan England, or before then, I suppose, Jacobean England. There is an uncertainty, religious upset, and rebelling is not a good thing. Stay home, do not leave. Whereas later, and the story of Robinson Crusoe is part of this, there is a sense of travel, of the importance of finding new places, of being entrepreneurial. And Robinson Crusoe is suggested in this way as someone who leaves in a positive way. He does come back, but he is a sort of paradigm of the entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that's quite a nice example of the way the reading of the parable shifts according to what society is perceived to need in its literature.
Okay.
Try that one.
Thank you. Ela disse, né, que a questão é da rebelião, né? É o menino que não quer ficar em casa, né? E nem sempre a aventura dele vai ser numa cidade ruim, né, num final ruim. Mas existe aquela sensação de voltar para casa, de recomeço, de reconstruir a vida em um outro lugar. E, de certa maneira, essa é a história de todos nós, né? Acho que é isso.
Bom, para encerrar, eu tenho então aqui a pergunta do Lucas Viana, que ele fez. Ele diz o seguinte: a obra da professora Alison foi uma inspiração para a minha pesquisa. Então, você
the narrative of Professor Alison was an inspiration for my research, for me, right?
Ela sabe que é do Lucas, né?
From Lucas is saying that, all right? Lucas Viana is saying that you were an inspiration for his work, for his construction, for his narrative.
Agora, a pergunta.
Now, the question.
De que maneira a senhora compreende a relação da parábola com o restante da narrativa lucana e sua recepção quase independente?
Vou tentar. Dá para fragmentar um pouquinho mais?
Claro. São duas questões, né? Como ela entende a relação entre a parábola.
What is the relation between the parable of the prodigal son and?
E essa recepção que ela mostrou para a gente, que é praticamente independente do Evangelho.
And the reception that you suggested, that you showed us, independent from the gospel, from Luke, right?
What's the relationship between Luke's reading and...
That's it. That's it. And what you brought to us this afternoon. Yeah.
So Luke is obviously reflecting on something in the ministry of Jesus, on a situation where the lost at the time are being pushed aside, and the stories are being told to encourage the society, the disciples, to accept and to welcome back those who are considered lost, in whatever that means at that moment. So that is the focus. Now, for me and my readings of much of the literature, the focus is not so much on telling people to welcome back the lost, but rather reflecting on something in the human condition that seeks homecoming. And so homecoming is probably the key trope in much of the literature I've looked at, but I'm not sure it's exactly the purpose of the parable in the context of Luke's gospel.
Que ela disse assim, né? Jesus, no ministério dele, então ele fala o contexto que eles viviam ali, então no texto, né, de Lucas, é aquilo que é representado ali no ministério de Jesus. Mas, né, quando nós vamos para o campo da literatura, a ênfase é o homecoming, quer dizer, o voltar para casa, né? Aquela reunião do aspecto de voltar para casa. Não sei se você quer acrescentar alguma coisa, Leonel, mas isso,
não,
eu estou tentando samar.
Tá bom. Bem, então chegamos ao final, não é? Estamos já mais de 4:30 da tarde, e eu agradeço a todos que estiveram conosco. Lembro que essa palestra foi gravada, então ela ficará disponível. E agradeço demais, novamente, ao professor Alison Jack, por estar com a gente.
Professor Alison Jack, we are more than 1 hour and a half together. Thank you very much for your time. This lecture was recorded. We are going to share with you. And thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for your excellent questions and for your attention and for the wonderful way you translated everything. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Lionel. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. And I want to hear how Lucas gets on in his research. Please keep in touch.
Ok. Ela que agradeceu, ela agradeceu bastante as perguntas, né? Foram perguntas maravilhosas, né? Então, foi uma troca muito rica. Depois ela quer saber um pouco mais sobre as pesquisas, né? Viu, Lucas? Essa é para você, porque ela quer saber mais da sua pesquisa. Acho que é isso.
Muito bem. Um abraço a todos.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Leonel,
Bye-bye.
can you...
Sim.
Okay.
Sim.
Professor Alison, thank you very much. Okay?
Thank you. Bye-bye then. Bye.
É que a cabeça começa a parar depois de um certo
Sim,
tempo, mas eu espero que tenha sido a contento aí.
Só, viu, Pedro? Jon, o Pedro tem que vir desligar, porque a gente está no YouTube, que é
Não, eu fui rapidinho só para dizer que se estava legal, se era isso aí.
Não, só estou dizendo o seguinte, a gente está no ar ainda, no YouTube, porque eu não tenho acesso. Aí eu preciso pedir para o Pedro desligar.
Tá bom, mas acho que depois a gente entra...
Não, eu posso te aguardar, sim, só eu preciso pedir para ele desligar.
Tá bom. Muito profundo, né? Muito legal, né? Muito bom.
Sim. Eu não sei. Não, eu acho que está rodando ainda no YouTube.
Você quer sair? A gente...
Não, bom, podemos sair da sala, né?
Depois eu...
Você quer conversar? A gente pode ir para uma sala, outra sala.
Eu te chamo, posso te chamar no WhatsApp aqui? Normal?
Pode, claro.
Então, obrigado. Até mais. Tchau.